10 years ago, I vanished on a hunting trip in the northern mountains. No body, no blood trail, just silence where a person used to be. My family buried an empty coffin. They cried at a funeral for a corpse that didn't exist. Then, like all families do, they moved on with life. What none of them knew was simple. I didn't die. I fell through a tear and the world itself, straight into something called the beast realm. You'd think falling into another dimension would come with a warning label. Mine came with teeth, a lot of teeth, almost immediately. For 10 years I lived among wolf packs, fought things with too many eyes, and slowly forgot what my own voice even sounded like anymore. I forgot the taste of cooked food. I forgot mirrors. At some point, I genuinely forgot my own face, because nothing there reflected anything back. What I never forgot, in a way that still aches, were my family's faces. Frozen in memory like an old photograph nobody asked me to keep. My mother's gentle scolding, my father's stern pride, my little sister's habit of stealing my dessert whenever she thought I wasn't watching, and one very loud, very food-obsessed golden retriever puppy named Biscuit, who chewed my shoes every morning like it was a sacred duty. 10 years is long enough to wonder if you're keeping memories alive, or if they're the only thing actually keeping you alive in return. Then one day, without warning, without any dramatic countdown, the same kind of tear that swallowed me a decade ago spat me back out. No fanfare, no system voice announcing a triumphant return, just dirt, blinding sunlight, and the smell of a city I hadn't breathed in years. My first thought wasn't joy, it was confusion, because my legs had completely forgotten what pavement felt like under bare feet. My second thought was hunger, because raw beast meat, somehow, does not compare to literally anything a human kitchen produces. My third thought, quieter underneath it all, was dread. What does a family even look like after a decade of grieving someone supposedly dead? I stood at the edge of the street leading to my old house, seriously considering turning back, because wolves never ask questions you can't answer. But my feet, stubborn things, kept moving anyway. Apparently some instincts survived 10 years of feral living completely intact. The house looked the same and entirely different at once, same gate, same color. Yet somehow it seemed smaller than I remembered it being. Or maybe I had simply outgrown what the house was built to hold. A decade among monsters does strange things to a person's posture. I reached the gate covered in dirt, my clothes barely qualifying as clothes anymore. Just strips of fabric that had given up entirely. My hair had grown long and wild, tangled with things I genuinely did not want to identify. My nails were closer to claws than fingernails. In short, I looked less like a returning son and more like something a horror director would cast without a single moment of hesitation. So when the front door opened and my family stepped out to see who was loitering at their gate, I understood exactly why they all froze. My father's hand instantly reached for the cane by the door. The same cane that had nothing to do with walking and everything to do with defense. My mother grabbed my little sister's arm and pulled her back a step, scanning me with a suspicion usually reserved for door-to-door scammers. Nobody said my name. Nobody hesitated before settling on stranger. The verdict was instant, unanimous, and honestly, completely fair. I opened my mouth to speak, and here's the part that embarrassed me more than anything else that had happened in the last 10 years combined. Nothing came out. Not a word, not a syllable. Just a broken sound between a cough and a growl, because silence breaks more than vocabulary. My father stepped forward, cane raised slightly, voice sharp with an authority that used to comfort me and now just made me feel unwanted. "This is private property," he said, each word clipped and careful. "Leave now, or I am calling the authorities immediately." I wanted to laugh. 10 years of dreaming about this exact doorway, and the welcome committee was a cane and a threat of police involvement. My little sister peeked from behind our mother, curiosity briefly beating caution, the way it does for kids who haven't fully learned fear yet. "Mom," she whispered, tugging on our mother's sleeve. His eyes looked kind of sad. Out of the mouths of children, apparently, even teenage ones. I tried again to speak, forcing air through a throat that hadn't formed a human word in so long it seemed to have forgotten the concept. What came out instead was a rough whimper, completely unintentional, completely humiliating, and completely useless for proving anything at all. My father took this as confirmation of danger rather than desperation, stepping protectively in front of his family like I was a wild animal, which, to be fair, given my current state, wasn't exactly an unreasonable conclusion for him to jump to in that exact moment. I stood at the gate of my own childhood home, unable to speak, unable to prove anything, watching my family brace against me like a threat. And just when the moment couldn't get more pathetic, a sound erupted behind the house. Frantic and joyful, completely mismatched with the tension. A heavy chain rattled violently, metal scraping against metal in a way that suggested whatever was attached had zero intention of staying put. My father turned sharply toward the noise, irritation flashing across his face. "Biscuit, quiet," he snapped. "Not now. Not now of all times. Biscuit." The name hit me harder than anything I felt in 10 years of claws and fangs in another dimension. Entirely unconcerned with mercy, the barking only grew louder, more frantic, paired with the unmistakable sound of something throwing its full weight against a restraint. Then came a sharp, final snap of metal giving way under sheer desperate force, followed by paws hitting dirt at a dead, reckless sprint. A massive golden shape came barreling around the corner of the house, ears flattened, tail blurring, moving faster than any aging dog should. My mother gasped, stepping back as this enormous, broken-chained dog shot past her like she was simply furniture standing in his way. My father shouted something about danger, about a strange man, and now a runaway animal. But none of it registered with the dog at all, because Biscuit, the puppy who chewed my shoes a decade ago, now graying and much larger, wasn't running away from me at all. He was running straight toward me, full speed, with the kind of unfiltered joy only an animal that never doubts its own senses can produce. My family saw a filthy stranger about to be attacked by their own dog. I saw the only living creature on the street who recognized me instantly. Biscuit hit me at full speed, nearly knocking me flat on my back, his entire body shaking, tail going so hard it looked ready to detach. He didn't growl. He didn't bark in warning. He pressed his whole weight against my legs and let out a sound I can only describe as crying. 10 years, and this dog remembered my smell, my voice, my exact way of standing, faster than my own blood ever managed to recognize me. My father froze mid-step, came lowering an inch, watching his loyal old guard dog behave like a puppy reunited with the center of its world. "Biscuit, get away from him," my mother shouted, voice cracking with fear. But the dog completely ignored her, burying his face against my hand. I knelt down slowly, every joint protesting after 10 years of running on all fours half the time, and let my fingers sink into familiar fur. He licked my face once, twice, then let out a long, low whine that sounded exactly like the sound he used to make whenever I left for school. My little sister stepped forward, eyes wide, voice barely a whisper. "Biscuit never does that," she said. "He hates strangers. He bites strangers." My mother's hand slowly fell from her chest, suspicion warring openly with something else entirely, something that looked dangerously like hope. My father's eyes moved from the dog, to me, to the dog again, calculating something he clearly didn't want to be calculating at all. I looked up at the three of them, dirt on my face, broken voice in my throat, and the only proof I had standing right beside me was a dog. And honestly, looking back on everything that happened next, that single golden retriever did more for my case than 10 years ever could. Because once Biscuit refused to leave my side, my family certainly cracked open just enough to ask the one question they hadn't dared ask yet. "Who exactly are you?" my father said quietly, voice no longer sharp, just tired, like he already suspected an answer he wasn't ready to hear. I opened my mouth one more time, and this time, after 10 years of silence, something close to an actual word finally crawled out. It came out broken, raspy, barely human, but unmistakable enough that my mother's entire body went rigid the second she heard it. "Dad," I managed to say, the single syllable costing more effort than surviving an entire decade in a realm built to kill anything weak. The cane slipped from my father's hand and hit the ground with a hollow clatter. That seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Nobody moved for a long moment. Not my mother, not my sister, not even Biscuit, who simply sat beside me like he'd been waiting his whole life. Then my mother's hand flew to her mouth, and the first sound she made wasn't a word either. It was something closer to a sob breaking loose. "It can't be," she whispered, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming caution, her eyes scanning my ruined face for something familiar. My sister, the loudest of all of us by nature, simply stood there frozen, tears already falling before her brain caught up with her heart. And my father, the man who never once cried in front of me growing up, made a sound I had genuinely never heard him make before that day. I want to tell you this was the moment everything became easy, warm, and simple. It wasn't. It was only the very beginning of something far stranger. Because surviving the beast realm for 10 years doesn't just change your voice or your face. It changes things far deeper than anyone realized yet. And the people standing in front of me, relieved as they were, had absolutely no idea what kind of son had actually walked back through the gate. For a few seconds, none of us moved. We just stood there, for people and one dog, frozen in a moment none of us had ever rehearsed for. Then my mother broke first, crossing the distance between us in 3 quick steps and grabbing my filthy, scarred face with both trembling hands. She didn't care about the dirt. She didn't care about the smell that I'm fairly sure could have knocked over a smaller, weaker human being. She just stared into my eyes like she was reading a book she thought had been lost forever, searching every line of my face for confirmation. "It really is you," she whispered, voice breaking apart on every single word, like speaking too loudly might shatter the moment completely. I wanted to say something comforting, something poetic. What actually came out was another rough, broken sound that wasn't quite a word at all. It didn't matter. She pulled me into a hug so tight it nearly cracked something in my back, and honestly, after 10 years, I let it happen. My father stood a few feet away, jaw clenched, eyes wet in a way he was clearly furious about, pretending to examine the broken chain instead. My little sister hovered nearby, unsure whether to hug the filthy stranger or keep her distance, eventually choosing somewhere awkwardly in between. Biscuit, meanwhile, had positioned himself directly between my legs like a furry anchor, refusing to let anyone forget he'd called this first. "Inside." He finally said, voice rough, gesturing toward the door like physical movement was easier than continuing whatever sentence he'd started. "We need to get him inside," my mother said firmly, switching instantly into the kind of practical crisis mode parents apparently never lose. "He needs food, water, clean clothes, and probably a doctor," she continued, already mentally building a list longer than my actual survival instincts. My father didn't argue. He simply stepped aside, holding the gate open, watching me walk past him with an expression I couldn't quite read yet. Walking through that gate again, after 10 years of imagining it from inside a forest built entirely to kill me, felt almost unreal in its simplicity. The hallway smelled exactly the same. Same wood polish, same faint trace of my mother's cooking, layered with 10 years of memories I never lost. My sister hovered close behind me the entire way, occasionally glancing at my ragged clothes like she expected something feral to crawl out of them. Honestly, given everything I'd survived recently, that wasn't an unreasonable fear for a 14-year-old to have about her supposedly dead brother. My mother guided me toward the bathroom first, muttering something about hot water and clean towels. Already moving faster than her age suggested, my father lingered at the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with the same careful expression he used to wear when negotiating difficult business deals. 10 years, he finally said quietly, almost to himself. 10 years, and you just walked back through the gate like you went out for groceries. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell him about the wolves, the portal, the years spent unlearning everything that made me human in the first place. Instead, all I managed was a tired half smile and another broken syllable that vaguely resembled the word later, which seemed to satisfy him slightly. The hot water hit my skin like a small miracle. 10 years of cold rivers and colder blood had apparently lowered my standards considerably. I watched years of dirt swirl down the drain, layer after layer, like the bathroom itself was peeling back a decade I hadn't fully processed yet. When I finally looked in the mirror, really looked, for the first time in 10 years, I almost didn't recognize the face staring back at me. Same general shape, same jawline my mother always said I inherited from her side. But the eyes underneath it all belonged to something else entirely. They weren't human eyes anymore, not completely. There was a faint shimmer underneath the surface, something that hadn't been there a decade ago. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself it was trauma playing tricks on tired eyes. Some small, quiet part of me knew that wasn't the whole truth. By the time I stepped out in borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit anymore, my family had gathered around the kitchen table like nothing had changed. Except everything had changed, and the empty fourth chair at the table had clearly been someone else's seat. For the better part of 10 years, my sister sat exactly where she used to sit, except now she looked older, sharper, with a guarded expression she definitely hadn't had as a child. My mother placed a bowl of warm soup in front of me with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the moment Biscuit broke his chain outside. My father sat at the head of the table, watching me eat with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. I ate slowly, carefully, every motion feeling foreign, like my body had forgotten the basic mechanics of using a spoon like a civilized person. Biscuit sat directly beside my chair, refusing to move even an inch. occasionally resting his graying head against my leg like he was checking I was real. For a while, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl and the steady, comforting breathing of an old dog. Then my sister finally broke the silence, voice careful, almost scientific. "Where were you?" she asked. "Like, actually where? For real." I set the spoon down slowly, trying to figure out how to explain another dimension to a teenager without sounding completely unhinged in the process. "Another place," I finally managed, voice still rough but steadier now. "Not here. Not anywhere on any map you've ever looked at in school." My father leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing with the same focus he used to study contracts before signing anything that mattered. "Try harder than that," he said, not unkindly, but with a firm tone of a man who had spent 10 years wanting answers he never thought he'd get. So I tried. I told them about the portal, the forest that wasn't quite a forest, the creatures that hunted in packs larger than entire neighborhoods. I told them about losing my voice from disuse, about learning to move on instinct alone, about forgetting things that should never be forgotten. My mother's hand covered her mouth more than once during the telling, while my sister leaned forward, equal parts horrified and completely fascinated. My father said nothing for most of it, simply listening, jaw tight, processing a story that sounded more like fiction than anything resembling reality. When I finally finished, the kitchen fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Biscuit's tail thumping softly against the floor in slow, steady rhythm. "That's insane," my sister finally whispered, then immediately looked guilty for saying it out loud, like the word itself might offend me somehow. "It's fine," I said, voice still strange in my own ears. I'd call it insane too, if I hadn't spent 10 years living inside it personally. My father stood up abruptly, walking to the window, staring out at the street like he expected the portal itself to be sitting there waiting for him. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" he asked quietly, not turning around, voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd been lied to before. It was a fair question. After 10 years, a wild story about another dimension probably ranks somewhere between unlikely and completely absurd. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy a man like my father. I had scars, a broken voice, and a dog who refused to leave my side for a second. Apparently, that turned out to be enough for now, because he simply exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping slightly, like a weight had shifted somehow. "We'll figure out the rest later," he said finally, turning back toward the table. "Tonight, you eat, you rest, and tomorrow we deal with everything else." Everything else turned out to be a much bigger phrase than any of us expected. But that night, none of us had any idea how big it would actually get. After dinner, my mother insisted on checking every visible scar on my arms, muttering quietly about doctors and tests and things I genuinely didn't want. I let her fuss over me anyway, because honestly, after 10 years without anyone fussing over anything I did, it felt strangely, embarrassingly nice. My sister disappeared upstairs at some point, only to return with an old photo album, flipping through pages of a childhood that suddenly felt foreign. "Look," she said, pointing at a picture of me at maybe 16, grinning stupidly with Biscuit as a tiny puppy chewing on my sneaker in the background. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to reconnect the grinning teenager with the person currently sitting in this kitchen, with claw scars. It felt like looking at someone else's life, familiar enough to ache, distant enough to feel like trespassing on a memory that wasn't quite mine anymore. Biscuit, sensing the shift in my mood the way dogs always do, climbed up beside me on the couch despite clearly not being allowed on the furniture. Nobody stopped him, not even my father, who simply watched from the doorway with an expression somewhere between disapproval and quiet relief. Later that night, lying in my old room for the first time in a decade, I stared at a ceiling I used to know every crack and stain of by heart. The room had been kept almost exactly the same, like a museum exhibit nobody had the heart to dismantle. Dust carefully wiped, but nothing rearranged. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like sleeping inside a memory that belonged to someone slightly different from who I'd become. Biscuit refused to sleep anywhere except directly against my side, exactly like he used to do as a puppy, except now he took up considerably more space. Somewhere around midnight, unable to sleep, I held my hand up in the darkness and watched something flicker faintly beneath my own skin. It wasn't dramatic, no glowing aura, no system notification floating helpfully in front of my face like the ridiculous stories I'd read years ago. Just a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, gone the second I focused on it directly, like my body was hiding something it wasn't ready to reveal yet. I told myself it was exhaustion again. I told myself a lot of comforting lies the first night, mostly because the alternative felt too big to face yet. The next morning arrived with the smell of breakfast and the unmistakable sound of raised voices coming from somewhere downstairs in the kitchen. I made my way down slowly, joints still stiff from 10 years of different terrain, to find my father on the phone, voice tight with barely contained anger. "I don't care what he wants," my father was saying, jaw clenched tight. "He doesn't get to just show up and start asking questions about inheritance." My mother stood nearby, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral in the way adults get when they're trying very hard not to react in front of children. My sister sat at the table, spoon frozen halfway to her mouth, clearly listening intently despite pretending to focus entirely on her cereal bowl. "What's going on?" I asked, voice still rough but noticeably clearer than the night before, surprising even myself with how steady it sounded now. My father lowered the phone slightly, covering the speaker with his palm, expression shifting the moment he registered my presence in the doorway. "Your cousin," he said carefully, like the words themselves tasted unpleasant. "He's coming over. Apparently he heard you're back, and he's curious." Something about the way he said curious made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a feeling I hadn't felt since my last encounter with an apex predator. "Which cousin?" I asked, even though some distant memory was already supplying an answer I wasn't entirely thrilled about. Hearing confirmed out loud, "Theo," my mother said quietly, not meeting my eyes directly. "He's been running a lot of things around here since you disappeared. A lot of things." The name landed differently than I expected. Theo had always been ambitious, sharp, the kind of person who smiled warmly while calculating everything. 10 years was apparently more than enough time for someone like that to climb very far, especially with the convenient absence of certain competition. I sat down slowly at the table, Biscuit immediately positioning himself protectively against my leg again, like he sensed the shift in atmosphere too. "How far did he climb exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice deliberately calm, even as something cold and unfamiliar settled low in my stomach. My father set his phone down on the counter, finally meeting my gaze directly. Expression heavy with information he clearly hadn't wanted to deliver yet. "He took over most of what should have been yours," he said quietly. "The business, certain assets, even some property that technically still belongs to you." I let that information settle for a moment, watching Biscuit's tail thump softly against the kitchen floor, the only calm thing in an increasingly tense room. "He thought you were dead," my mother added quickly, like she felt the sudden need to defend a decision that clearly still bothered her deeply. "We all thought you were dead," she continued, voice softening. "Someone had to keep things running. Theo simply stepped in when nobody else could." I understood the logic completely. I even understood the necessity of it. What I didn't entirely understand yet was the look my father had given the phone. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to suspicion. The same expression he used to wear right before catching someone lying. Before I could ask anything further, the doorbell rang, sharp and confident. Exactly the kind of sound a person makes when they already feel entitled to entry. My mother stood quickly, smoothing her apron, glancing nervously between the door and me, like she was bracing for a collision she couldn't quite prevent. Biscuit's ears flattened instantly the moment the door opened, a low, almost silent rumble building in his chest that I hadn't heard from him yet. And standing in the doorway, wearing a suit that cost more than my entire 10-year survival kit ever could, was a face I hadn't seen since I was 18. Theo smiled the second his eyes landed on me, warm and practiced. The exact kind of smile people use right before saying something quietly devastating. "Well," he said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Look who finally decided to crawl back from the dead after 10 whole years." Biscuit's low growl finally broke into something audible, a warning rumble that made Theo pause for half a second before recovering his smile. "Easy, boy," Theo said smoothly, not even looking at the dog, eyes locked entirely on me like I was a problem he intended to solve quickly today. My father stepped between us slightly, voice carefully neutral. "Theo, he came home yesterday. We're still figuring out a lot of details ourselves." Of course," Theo said, raising both hands in mock surrender, the practiced smile never once slipping from his perfectly composed face. "I just wanted to see him with my own eyes," he continued. 10 years is a long time. People change. Stories change. I'm sure you understand my caution." I sat there silently, watching him skin me from head to toe, the same way a buyer inspects livestock before deciding whether it's worth the asking price. "You look different," he finally said, settling into a chair across from me without being invited, like ownership of the room was simply assumed. Different how? I asked, voice steady now, surprising myself again with how quickly my body seemed to be relearning old, useful instincts. Theo shrugged lightly, rougher, wilder. Honestly, a little unsettling, if I'm being completely honest with you, the way family should be. Biscuits growled deep and slightly, and for the first time since walking in, Theo's smile flickered, just for a second, just enough to notice it. My mother quickly stepped in, voice bright and forced. Would anyone like coffee? She asked, the universal signal for please let's de-escalate immediately. Theo waved her off without looking away from me. I'm fine. Thank you. I just have a few simple questions, if our returning hero doesn't mind answering. Go ahead, I said, leaning back slightly, letting Biscuit's solid weight against my leg anchor me in a way that felt steadier than I expected. Where exactly were you for 10 years? Theo asked, voice casual, though his eyes were anything but casual as they studied my every small reaction. Somewhere far away, I said simply. Somewhere that doesn't show up on any map you've ever bothered looking at. In your entire comfortable life. Theo chuckled, though there was no warmth in it at all. Vague answers tend to make people nervous, he said. You understand that, don't you, cousin? I'm not trying to make anyone nervous, I replied evenly. I'm trying to remember how to use a fort properly. The rest can wait until I'm ready to share it. My father cleared his throat sharply. Theo, he said, tone hardening slightly. This isn't an interrogation. He just got home. Show a little patience. Theo held his hands up again. That same easy, practiced gesture of innocence that I was already starting to find deeply, instinctively unconvincing. Of course, uncle, he said smoothly. I only ask because, well, certain documents will need updating now. Inheritance matters tend to get complicated. There it was, the real reason behind the visit, finally surfacing beneath all that performed warmth like a shark fin breaking the surface of calm water. What kind of documents? My mother asked sharply, all pretense of hospitality suddenly gone from her voice entirely, replaced by something protective. Theo's smile widened slightly, like he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions so he could deliver his rehearsed answer. Just standard things, he said lightly. Property transfers, business shares, nothing that can't be sorted out smoothly between reasonable family members. I studied his face carefully while he spoke, noticing the small, almost invisible tells of a man who had clearly rehearsed this exact conversation before. Reasonable family members, I repeated slowly. That's an interesting phrase to use right after implying I might not actually be who I say I am. Theo's expression flickered again, quick and controlled. But tenures among predators teaches you to notice exactly the kind of fleeting weakness. I never said that, he replied smoothly, though his eyes said something entirely different from his carefully chosen, perfectly diplomatic words. You didn't have to say it, I said quietly. You just spent the last 5 minutes implying it in every single sentence you've spoken since walking in. The kitchen went silent except for the low, steady hum of Biscuit's growl, which had settled into a constant background warning none of us ignored. My father finally stood, voice firm in a way I hadn't heard since I was a teenager being scolded for something genuinely stupid I'd done. I think that's enough for today, Theo, he said. Whatever paperwork exists can wait until we've had more than 24 hours to process all of this. Theo stood as well, smoothing his jacket, expression returning to that calm, friendly mask like nothing tense had happened in this room at all. Of course, uncle, he said. Take your time. I'll have the documents ready whenever everyone's ready to move forward with proper legal procedure. He turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back at me one final time with an expression I genuinely couldn't decipher completely yet. Welcome home, cousin, he said, voice almost gentle, almost sincere, except for the small, sharp edge buried somewhere underneath every single word. It's good to have you back, he added, stepping outside, leaving behind the silence in the kitchen that felt heavier than anything spoken aloud before. The door clicked shut, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all, the only sound being Biscuit's growl slowly fading into a low, tired sigh. My mother finally exhaled, shoulders dropping like she'd been holding her breath the entire time Theo stood in our kitchen, drinking up the tension. He's gotten worse, she said quietly, almost to herself, like she was confirming something she'd been afraid to say out loud for quite some time now. My father sat back down heavily, rubbing his temples with one hand, the picture of a man dealing with far too much for a single morning to handle. He's had 10 years to get worse, he said grimly. 10 years to build himself a kingdom out of pieces. that were never actually his to take in the first place. I looked down at Biscuit, who looked back up at me with the same steady, loyal eyes he'd had as a puppy, completely unaffected by suits or paperwork. At least someone in this house still recognizes who actually belongs here, I muttered, scratching behind his ears, earning a satisfied huff in response. My sister finally spoke, voice quiet but firm in a way that surprised me, given how young she'd been the last time I had actually paid attention to her. He's been awful since you disappeared, she said. Like, genuinely awful. Everyone just got used to it because nobody thought you were coming back. Well, I said slowly, standing up despite the ache still settling deep into every joint. I guess somebody forgot to tell that to a very stubborn old dog. That night, lying awake again with Biscuit pressed firmly against my side, I replayed every single word Theo had said, searching for the actual threat. It wasn't subtle once you looked past the polished suit and rehearsed smile. He wasn't just curious about my return. He was already planning around it. 10 years was enough time to build something. It was also enough time to learn exactly how fragile that something becomes when the rightful owner returns. I thought about the faint shimmer beneath my skin from the night before, the strange, unexplainable thing my body seemed to be hiding from me still. Whatever had happened to me in that realm, whatever I'd actually brought back with me beyond scars and broken vocabulary, Theo had absolutely no idea yet. And honestly, lying there in the dark with an old dog snoring softly against my ribs, I decided I wasn't in any particular hurry to enlighten him either. Some advantages I learned the hard way over 10 brutal years work far better when the person standing across from you completely underestimates them. Theo thought he was dealing with a broken, confused man stumbling back from the dead, grateful and harmless, easy enough to maneuver around quietly. He had no idea that the realm I survived didn't just take 10 years away from me. It left something behind in return, something he hadn't accounted for. The next morning, my mother insisted on taking me to see a doctor, partly for my health, and partly, I suspected, to have something normal to focus on. The car ride through the city felt surreal. Buildings taller than I remembered, streets busier. The entire world having simply continued without pausing. People glanced at me on the street, then quickly looked away. The universal reaction to someone who clearly looked like they'd survived something terrible. At the clinic, the doctor ran the usual tests: blood pressure, basic reflexes, the standard checklist for a man returning from 10 mysterious years away. Then she paused over my blood sample results, frowning slightly, tapping her pen against the clipboard like the numbers in front of her didn't make sense. These readings are unusual, she said carefully, not in an alarmed way, but in the way professionals speak when they're trying not to sound alarmed at all. Unusual how? My mother asked immediately, voice sharp with the protective edge she'd clearly been carrying close to the surface. Since I came home, the doctor hesitated, glancing at me directly. Your cellular regeneration markers are abnormally high, she said. Higher than anything I've personally seen. I didn't have a clean explanation for that, so I simply shrugged, letting my silence speak for the parts of the story I still wasn't ready to share fully. She ran a few more tests, each result apparently raising more questions than answers, until she finally set the clipboard down with a tired, careful sigh. Whatever you went through, she said slowly, your body adapted in ways medicine doesn't really have a framework for explaining clearly just yet. That, I thought to myself, was putting it extremely mildly compared to everything I actually knew but had absolutely no intention of explaining to her. On the drive home, my mother kept glancing at me sideways at red lights, clearly turning the doctor's words over in her mind without saying anything yet. Are you in pain? She finally asked, voice softer now, the protective edge replaced by something closer to quiet, exhausted worry for her returned son. No, I said honestly. I actually feel stronger than I should after everything. Stronger than I did before I even disappeared, if I'm being completely honest. She didn't respond right away. Eyes fixed on the road, hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel like she was processing something difficult. Just be careful, she said eventually. Whatever changed in you out there, your father and I just got you back. We're not ready to lose you again so soon. I promised her I'd be careful. The way every returning son probably promises that exact thing without fully understanding what careful would even require. Because the truth, the part I genuinely hadn't worked out myself yet, was that something inside me had absolutely no intention of staying quiet for long. That evening, alone in the backyard while my family handled calls about Theo's paperwork, I decided to test something I'd been avoiding since waking up here. I focused inward, the same way I used to before a hunt in the beast realm. searching for the strange shimmer that occasionally surfaced beneath my skin. At first, nothing happened. Just me, standing awkwardly in my childhood backyard, feeling slightly ridiculous about talking quietly to my own bloodstream. Then, slowly, my vision sharpened in a way I hadn't experienced even during my most desperate moments. Fighting for survival deep inside that other realm, colors grew impossibly vivid. Sounds I shouldn't have been able to hear from this distance suddenly became crystal clear, layered and distinct from each other. I could hear my sister's heartbeat through the closed windows. I could hear Biscuit's careful, curious paws patting toward me from somewhere inside the house. Whatever I'd brought back from the realm wasn't just scars and broken language. Something had fundamentally rewritten parts of me I hadn't fully tested yet. Biscuit appeared at the back door, ears perked, watching me with an expression that looked suspiciously close to understanding exactly what was happening. "Yeah," I said quietly, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears again. "I think you might be the only one in this entire family ready for what's coming next. Because somewhere across the city, in an office that should have belonged to me, Theo was already preparing paperwork meant to erase me all over again. This time, unlike 10 years ago, I had absolutely no intention of disappearing quietly without putting up the kind of fight he wasn't prepared for. 2 days after Theo's visit, I finally understood something important. 10 years in the beast realm hadn't just changed my body, it had changed my patience. Back there, you didn't get the luxury of waiting around to see what a threat would do next. You acted first, or you became somebody's dinner immediately. Theo wasn't a wolf. He didn't have claws or fangs, but the calculating look in his eyes reminded me of predators who learned to smile before they struck. So instead of waiting for his lawyers to show up with paperwork, I decided it was time to actually understand what kind of empire he built without me. My father reluctantly handed me a folder that morning, thick with documents he'd clearly been avoiding showing me since the moment I first walked through the gate. "This is everything Theo's been managing," he said, voice tired. "Property deeds, shareholder records, contracts I honestly stopped fully understanding years ago." I sat at the kitchen table, Biscuit's head resting heavily on my knee, and started reading through 10 years of decisions made entirely without my consent. The first thing I noticed was how clean everything looked. To clean, documents that organized don't usually come from someone with nothing to hide carefully. The second thing I noticed was a name that kept appearing alongside Theo's. On almost every major contract, someone called Director Hallworth, completely unfamiliar to me. "Who's Hallworth?" I asked, sliding the folder slightly toward my father, who glanced at the name and immediately stiffened in a way that told me plenty. "He came in about 6 years ago," my father said slowly. "Some kind of consultant Theo brought on board. Smart, quiet. Never liked the way he looked at people." That description alone earned Hallworth a permanent spot on my mental list of people worth watching closely, right beside Theo and his rehearsed smiles. My sister wandered in halfway through breakfast, peering over my shoulder at the documents with the same curious, unfiltered nosiness she'd had as a kid. "That's so boring," she said, wrinkling her nose at a page full of legal language. "How do you even understand any of this without falling asleep instantly?" 10 years of survival apparently makes paperwork look downright relaxing in comparison, I told her, which earned me a look somewhere between confusion and concern. My mother, meanwhile, kept finding small excuses to walk past the kitchen, checking on me like I might dissolve in the smoke the second she looked away too long. I didn't blame her for the constant hovering. If our positions had been reversed, I probably would have spent every waking hour making sure she was still real too. By midday, I found 3 separate contracts where Theo had quietly transferred property that legally still belonged to me, using paperwork built around my supposed death. It wasn't exactly illegal, given the circumstances at the time. It was, however, the kind of opportunistic cleanup job that told me everything about his real priorities. I decided the smartest move wasn't confrontation, not yet. I needed to see his operation directly, the way you scout dangerous territory before deciding how to approach it. That afternoon, I told my parents I wanted to visit the old company offices, just to look around, just to remember a building I used to walk through every single day. My father offered to come with me. I gently declined, partly because I needed to do this alone, and partly because Biscuit had already decided he was coming regardless. He sat in the back seat the entire drive, head out the window, ears flapping, completely unbothered by the fact that we were heading straight into enemy territory. Honestly, watching him enjoy the wind on his face made the entire trip feel slightly less ominous, even though my stomach hadn't fully settled since leaving the house. The company building looked exactly the same from the outside, glass and steel rising into the sky. Except now there was a new name etched proudly above the entrance. Hallworth and Associates, the sign read. Like 10 years of disappearance had been enough time to completely erase any trace of the family name that originally built this place. I parked across the street, staring up at that sign for longer than necessary, feeling something cold and unfamiliar settle low in my chest at the sight of it. Biscuit pressed his nose against the window, whining softly, like even he understood there was something deeply wrong about a building that used to belong to us. I almost turned the car around right there, almost decided this could wait for another day. Another approach, something less reckless than walking in completely unannounced. Then I thought about Theo's smile and our kitchen, the careful way he'd implied I might not even be myself, and decided reckless was exactly the energy this moment required. I left Biscuit in the car with the window cracked, promising him a treat the size of his entire head if he behaved himself for the next 20 minutes. Give or take, walking through the front doors felt strange, like stepping into a memory that someone had quietly redecorated, without asking permission from the person who used to live there. The receptionist looked up, professional smile fixed in place, clearly having no idea who I was or why my presence alone made the air in the lobby feel slightly heavier. Can I help you, sir? She asked, eyes flicking briefly toward my still healing scars before quickly returning to professional. Practice neutrality. I'm here to see Theo, I said simply, watching her expression shift the moment that name registered, replaced almost instantly by something close to nervous caution. Do you have an appointment? She asked, fingers already hovering over her keyboard, clearly preparing to either schedule me in or politely escort me back outside. Tell him his cousin is here, I said. He'll understand exactly what that means, even without an appointment slot conveniently penciled into his calendar somewhere. She hesitated for a long moment, studying my face like she was trying to match it against some photograph buried deep in company records from a decade ago. Then her eyes widened slightly, the kind of recognition that comes from old gossip suddenly clicking into place inside someone's memory after years of dormancy. You're him, she said quietly, almost to herself. The one everyone said was dead. I read about you in the company archive when I first started working here. I'm definitely not dead, I said, attempting something close to a reassuring smile that probably looked slightly unsettling, given my current general appearance. She picked up the phone with visibly shaking hands, speaking quietly, glancing at me every few seconds like I might suddenly vanish if she looked away too long. A few minutes later, an elevator chimed open and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out, scanning me with cold, calculating eyes that immediately set me on edge. This had to be Hallworth. Nobody else in this building would carry themselves with that exact mixture of confidence and contempt for someone they hadn't met yet. Mr. Hallworth, the receptionist said quickly. This is Theo's cousin, the one who disappeared. He's asking to see Theo directly, right now. Hallworth's expression barely shifted, just a small, almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, the kind of reaction you only notice if you've spent years reading Predators. How interesting, he said smoothly, voice carrying none of the warmth his words technically implied. Theo mentioned you'd returned. I assumed he was exaggerating. Exaggerating how? I asked, keeping my tone level despite every instinct screaming that this man was considerably more dangerous than Theo had ever appeared to be. He mentioned a confused, broken man stumbling home after a decade lost somewhere unexplainable. He said, you don't quite match the particular description, honestly. People tend to undersell things they're hoping won't become a problem for them later, I said, watching his expression flicker with something close to genuine interest. Hallworth studied me for a long moment, then gestured toward the elevator with a small, almost mocking smile that made my skin crawl in an unfamiliar way entirely. Theo's in a meeting, he said, but I think he'd genuinely want to see this for himself. Please, follow me, I insist, given how rare these family reunions seem to be. I followed him into the elevator, every instinct from 10 years of survival screaming caution, while every stubborn part of me refused to back down from this moment. The ride-up was silent, tense, filled only with the quiet hum of machinery and the distant, comforting awareness that Biscuit was still waiting loyally in the car below. When the doors finally opened, we stepped into a sleek, modern office floor that bore absolutely no resemblance to the building I remembered from a decade earlier. Everything was glass, chrome, and the kind of expensive minimalist design that screamed someone had spent an enormous amount of money proving a very specific point. Hallworth led me toward a large conference room, where through the glass wall, I could see Theo standing at the head of the table, mid-presentation to several investors. He paused mid-sentence the moment he saw me through the glass, expression flickering through surprise, irritation, and something close to genuine alarm in quick succession. He excused himself quickly, stepping out into the hallway, that practiced smile sliding back into place a half-second, to slowly for it to feel entirely natural. "Cousin," he said, voice pitched for an audience even though the hallway was otherwise empty. "This is unexpected. I didn't realize you were planning to visit today. I figured I'd save us both some time," I said, "since apparently there's paperwork waiting that requires my signature. I thought I should see exactly what I'm signing." Theo's eyes flicked briefly toward Hallworth, some silent conversation passing between them that I clearly wasn't meant to fully understand or even notice happening. "Of course," Theo said smoothly, though perhaps somewhere a bit more private would be appropriate, considering some of this involves sensitive company information. He guided me toward a smaller office down the hall, Hallworth trailing a few steps behind, close enough to feel less like courtesy and more like quiet, deliberate supervision. Once inside, Theo closed the door, the friendly mask dropping slightly faster than it had downstairs, replaced by something colder, more calculated, more honest. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. "This isn't the right environment for someone still adjusting to civilization after everything you apparently went through." "Funny," I said, sitting down across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "I was thinking the exact same thing about you the moment I saw that sign outside." Theo's jaw tightened slightly, the first genuine crack I'd seen in his composure since walking through those front doors 20 minutes earlier with zero warning given. "This company exists because I kept it alive while everyone assumed you were dead," he said, voice sharper now. "I don't owe you an apology for surviving without you." "I never asked for an apology," I said calmly. "I'm simply asking why my name disappeared from every single document, the same year my body disappeared from this world." Hallworth, standing quietly near the door, spoke for the first time since entering the office, voice smooth and entirely too composed for someone supposedly uninvolved. "Legal necessity," he said simply. "The company required clear ownership to maintain stability. Ambiguity tends to frighten investors far more than confirmed leadership does. Convenient that the confirmed leadership happened to be you," I said, glancing pointedly between the two of them, watching Theo's composure tighten another careful notch. Theo leaned forward slightly, hands flat on the desk, voice dropping into something quieter, more dangerous than the polite tone he'd used back in our kitchen earlier. "Listen carefully," he said. "I'm willing to be generous here. A settlement, a comfortable allowance. You disappear quietly back into private life, and everyone stays happy. And if I don't agree to disappear quietly?" I asked, voice steady despite the cold weight settling deeper into my chest with every passing second in this office. Theo's smile returned, thin and humorless. "Then things become considerably more complicated for someone still struggling to even speak in complete sentences clearly." It was a threat disguised as concern. The exact kind of sentence built to sound reasonable to anyone listening from outside this room. Without context behind it, I stood up slowly, deliberately unhurried, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make both of them visibly uncomfortable. Before I finally spoke again, "I appreciate the generous offer," I said, "but I think I'll keep my name attached to the company my own grandfather built, if it's all the same to everyone involved here." Hallworth's expression shifted slightly, something calculating behind his eyes that I genuinely didn't like the look of, even without fully understanding what it meant yet. "That's unfortunate," he said quietly. "Legal disputes tend to get messy, especially when certain medical and psychological evaluations come into play eventually." There it was again, the same subtle implication from Theo days earlier, except now delivered by someone considerably more dangerous and far less emotionally invested. "Are you suggesting I'm unfit?" I asked directly, watching Hallworth's expression remain perfectly neutral, the kind of neutrality that only comes from careful, deliberate practice. "I'm suggesting nothing," he said smoothly. "I'm simply noting that 10 years of unexplained absence raises understandable questions about a person's current mental state." Theo said nothing, letting Hallworth carry the weight of the threat, which told me plenty about exactly who was actually steering this particular ship behind the scenes. I walked toward the door, pausing briefly with my hand on the handle, turning back to look at both of them one final time before leaving this conversation entirely. "You should be careful what you suggest about someone you genuinely know nothing about," I said quietly. 10 years changes a person in ways paperwork can't measure. Neither of them responded immediately, and honestly, The silence that followed felt far more satisfying than any clever comeback I could have possibly delivered. Instead, I left the office, walked past the receptionist, who watched me go with wide, curious eyes, and stepped back into the elevator without looking back even once. Biscuit greeted me in the car with a kind of enthusiastic, tail-wagging relief that suggested 20 minutes alone had felt considerably longer from his perspective. I sat there for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying every word Hallworth had spoken with calm, calculated precision. Mental state evaluations weren't just casual threats. They were the exact kind of legal maneuver someone could use to quietly remove an inconvenient error from the picture. If they could convince a court I wasn't mentally fit to manage my own affairs, Theo's settlement offer would become considerably less generous and far more enforceable. I drove home slower than usual, partly out of caution, and partly because my mind kept circling back to the cold certainty in Hallworth's eyes when he'd spoken. That night, I told my father everything, watching his expression darken with every detail, the cane resting forgotten beside his chair as he listened in silence. Hallworth, he repeated slowly, like the name itself tasted bitter. I always knew there was something wrong about that man. I should have trusted that feeling years ago. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she listened, fear and anger warring openly across her face in a way I hadn't seen since the day Biscuit broke his chain. They can't actually do that, can they? My sister asked, voice smaller than usual. The confident curiosity from earlier replaced by genuine worry for my safety now. I don't know, I admitted honestly, but I'm not exactly planning to wait around and find out the hard way, especially not after everything I survived to get back here. Biscuit, sensing the tension thick in the room, climbed onto the couch beside me, resting his graying head heavily against my arm like a silent, steady promise. Later that night, alone in my room again, I finally allowed myself to think seriously about the strange shimmer beneath my skin, the heightened senses I had tested earlier. If Theo and Hallworth wanted to fight this with paperwork and legal threats, fine. But I had spent 10 years learning that some battles required entirely different weapons. I closed my eyes, focusing inward the way I had in the backyard, searching for whatever piece of the beast realm had decided to follow me home uninvited. This time, the shimmer responded faster, spreading warmly beneath my skin, sharpening my senses until I could hear every small creak of the house settling around me. I held my hand up in the darkness, watching faint lines of something pale and silver trace briefly across my knuckles, before fading as quickly as they'd appeared. Whatever this was, it wasn't fully awake yet. It felt more like something stirring slowly after a long sleep, testing its limits one cautious inch at a time. I thought about the wolves I'd run with for years, the way their pack instincts had slowly bled into my own movements, my own reflexes, my own way of reading threats. Maybe that's exactly what this was. Not some random side effect of survival, but something the realm itself had deliberately left behind inside me before letting me leave. Biscuit shifted beside me on the bed, lifting his head slightly, nose twitching in my direction like even he could sense something different happening beneath my skin. It's fine, I told him quietly, scratching behind his ears the way I always did when he seemed unsettled. I think we're just getting started understanding all of this. The next few days passed in a strange, uneasy rhythm. Family dinners filled with quiet conversation, careful questions, and the constant underlying tension of Theo's threat. My father quietly began reaching out to old contacts, lawyers he trusted decades ago, trying to understand exactly how strong Theo's legal position actually was now. My mother insisted on documenting every single doctor's visit, every test result, building what she called a paper trail in case anyone ever questioned my mental state. My sister, surprisingly, became my most enthusiastic ally, spending hours researching company law online, determined to find loopholes nobody had bothered considering yet. You'd be surprised what teenagers can find when they're motivated by pure spite towards someone who's been awful to their entire family for an entire decade straight. I spent my mornings slowly rebuilding strength I'd technically never lost, running laps around the backyard with Biscuit, testing the limits of senses still settling in. By the end of the first week, I could hear conversations from rooms away, track movement through walls by sound alone, and recover from minor injuries unnaturally fast. It wasn't quite the raw power I'd had during my most desperate fights in the beast realm, but it was returning steadily, like muscle memory slowly waking from hibernation. One evening, while testing exactly how far my hearing actually reached, I caught something through an open window that made my entire body go suddenly, completely still. It was my father's voice, low and careful, speaking on the phone in his study, clearly believing himself to be completely alone and unheard by anyone in the house. "I know it's risky," he was saying, "but if Hallworth's pushing this hard, there has to be something he's protecting. Something bigger than company shares or property deeds." I crept closer to the window, every survival instinct from a decade of careful hunting kicking in automatically. Silent and patient, exactly the way wolves had taught me. "Find out everything you can about him," my father continued. "Where he came from, who he's connected to, anything that explains why he's this desperate to keep control." There was a pause, presumably while whoever he was speaking with responded, before my father spoke again, voice noticeably heavier with something close to genuine fear. "If something happens to me before this is resolved," he said quietly, "make sure my son has everything he needs to fight this properly. He deserves it much, at minimum." I stood frozen outside the window for a long moment, processing words I genuinely wasn't supposed to hear. Feeling something cold and protective settle deep in my chest. My father, the man who barely cried in front of me my entire childhood, was quietly preparing contingency plans in case something happened to him during this fight. That night, I didn't sleep much. Biscuit curled tightly against my side, both of us listening to a house that suddenly felt considerably more fragile than it had before. Whatever Hallworth was protecting, whatever made him desperate enough to threaten legal action against a man who'd survived 10 years in literal hell, it was bigger than money. And the more I thought about it, lying awake in the dark with my heightened senses picking up every small sound in the house, the more certain I became of one simple thing. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. Somewhere underneath all that polished paperwork and careful legal threats, something far more dangerous was quietly waiting. 3 days later, my father called an emergency family meeting in his study, voice tight with barely controlled urgency that immediately set my nerves on edge entirely. He had a contact, he said, someone reliable who'd worked in corporate investigations for decades. Someone who'd just sent back information that genuinely terrified him. "Hallworth isn't actually his real name," my father said, sliding a folder across the desk toward me, hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and fear combined. Inside the folder were photographs, documents, recorded spanning several different countries, each one connected to a man who'd apparently used at least for different identities. "Every single company he's been involved with," my father continued, "eventually collapsed under mysterious circumstances, right after he extracted everything valuable first." I studied the photographs carefully, watching the same cold, calculating eyes stare back at me from different faces, different names, different carefully constructed lives. "He's not building a business empire," I said slowly, piecing it together as I spoke. "He's strip mining one. Theo's company is just the latest carcass he's picked clean." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, the full weight of the situation finally settling in completely. "And Theo has no idea what he's actually invited into this family. Or worse," my sister said quietly, voice unusually serious. "Maybe he does know, and he simply doesn't care, as long as he gets to keep pretending he's actually in charge." That possibility hung heavy in the room, nobody quite willing to say it directly, though we were all clearly thinking the exact same uncomfortable thought simultaneously. Biscuit, sensing the shift in atmosphere, let out a low, uneasy whine, pressing himself against my leg like he wanted to physically anchor me to this exact moment. "What do we do now?" my mother asked quietly, looking between my father and me, like the answer might somehow be obvious to either of us despite the impossible weight involved. "We expose him," I said simply, carefully, methodically, "before he has the chance to do to this family whatever he's apparently done to every single company before this one." My father nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders now that there was finally a plan forming, even one as vague and dangerous as the one I'd just suggested. "But exposing a man like that requires proof," he said. "Real proof, not just suspicion and old company records that he could easily dismiss as outdated coincidence." "I'll get proof," I said, surprising myself slightly with how certain I sounded, given that I genuinely had no clear idea yet how exactly I planned to accomplish that. Some quiet, stubborn part of me, the same part that survived 10 years among wolves and worse, had already decided this fight wasn't ending with paperwork and lawyers. That night, standing alone on the back porch with Biscuit beside me, I focused inward again, deliberately reaching for whatever strange power still slept beneath my skin. This time, the shimmer responded almost instantly, spreading warmth through my chest. sharpening every sense until the entire backyard felt impossibly, vividly alive around me. I could smell rain 3 streets away. I could hear my sister's careful, steady breathing through her closed bedroom window upstairs. Calm and finally, mercifully asleep. And somewhere underneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, I caught a scent I genuinely hadn't expected to recognize this clearly. Carried faintly on the evening breeze, it was the same cold, metallic smell that used to precede the most dangerous predators in the beast realm. The ones that hunted quietly, patiently, without ever announcing themselves first. Biscuit's ears flattened instantly, his low growl returning, body tensing beside me like he'd caught the exact same warning. Carried on that same uneasy breeze tonight. Somewhere out there, beyond the comfortable boundaries of this familiar street, something dangerous was watching this house, and apparently, it had been watching for a while. I didn't know yet whether it was connected to Hallworth, to Theo, or to something else entirely that none of us had even considered as a possibility. Until this exact moment. What I did know, standing there in the dark with an old dog growling protectively beside me, was that whatever came next would require far more than careful paperwork. And for the first time since walking through the gate 10 days ago, I actually felt something close to ready for whatever was quietly approaching this family next. I woke my father quietly, careful not to alarm my mother or sister, and told him what I'd sensed. Watching his face shift from confusion to something far darker. "Are you certain?" he asked, voice low, glancing toward the dark windows like the thing I'd smelled might somehow be visible. If he simply looked hard enough at the glass. "I'm certain something was out there," I said honestly. "I'm less certain about what it actually was." But Biscuit reacted the same way I did. And dogs don't usually lie. My father grabbed his cane, more out of habit than actual usefulness. And together we walked the perimeter of the backyard, flashlights cutting through the darkness carefully. There was nothing visible, no footprints, no broken branches. Nothing a normal investigation would ever find as proof, except for one small, strange detail near the fence. A patch of grass, roughly the size of a large dog, had been pressed flat in a perfect oval, like something heavy had crouched there for a long, patient stretch of time. My father knelt down, running his fingers over the flattened grass, expression unreadable in the dim porch light spilling weakly across the edge of the yard. "Could be a deer," he said, though his voice carried none of the confidence the words were supposed to project. More like a hope than an actual genuine conclusion. "Deers don't usually smell like cold metal and old blood," I said quietly, watching his expression tighten further as the comforting deer theory quickly dissolved completely. We didn't sleep much that night. I stayed on the porch for hours, since it stretched as far as they could reach, while Biscuit paced restlessly along the fence line nearby. Nothing returned. Whatever had been watching the house apparently decided observation was enough for one evening, content to disappear back into whatever shadow it came from. The next morning, exhausted but alert, I called the one person from my old life I genuinely trusted enough to ask for help without worrying about hidden motives involved. Marcus had been my closest friend before everything happened. The kind of friend who actually attended the fake funeral and apparently never fully believed I was gone. He answered on the second ring, voice instantly recognizable despite 10 years of distance, and went completely silent for nearly 30 seconds once I said his name. "You're actually alive," he finally said, voice cracking slightly. "I heard rumors around town, but honestly, I figured someone was just messing with me cruelly somehow. I'm alive," I confirmed, "and I need a favor that's probably going to sound completely insane, considering everything you already know about my supposed disappearance. Try me," he said immediately, no hesitation at all. The exact loyalty I remembered from before everything fell apart, apparently untouched by an entire decade passing. Marcus worked in private security now, the kind of job that involved discreet investigations, surveillance equipment, and the careful patience required to watch without being noticed. "I need eyes on someone named Hallworth," I said. "Quiet, careful, nothing that traces back to my family directly. I think he's more dangerous than anyone currently realizes." Marcus agreed without asking too many questions, the kind of trust that comes from years of friendship built long before either of us understood how fragile life could actually get. "Give me a few days," he said. "If this guy's been burning through identities like you're describing, there's bound to be a trail somewhere, even if he's careful about hiding it." While Marcus worked his angle, I focused on something closer to home, determined to understand exactly what had been watching our backyard the night before. With such patience, I started running early morning patrols around the neighborhood, Biscuit trotting happily beside me. both of us testing the boundaries of senses, still slowly waking up fully. On the third morning, near the edge of the woods bordering our property, I found another patch of flattened grass, fresher this time. The cold metallic scent considerably stronger. Whoever or whatever this was, it was getting bolder, moving closer to the house each time. No longer satisfied with simply watching from a comfortable, careful distance, I crouched down, studying the indentation carefully, noticing something I'd missed the first time entirely. A faint trace of something dark and slightly iridescent staining the grass. I dabbed a small sample onto a cloth, careful not to touch it directly with bare skin, some deep, instinctive part of me screaming that direct contact would be a serious mistake. Biscuit sniffed the stain cautiously, then immediately backed away, whining low in his throat. The same reaction he'd had towards certain dangerous animals back before I disappeared. Whatever this substance was, it clearly wasn't something native to our world, and that realization alone sent a cold, familiar chill crawling slowly down my entire spine. I brought the sample home, locked it carefully in an old metal box in my room, and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining the implications. Because if something from the beast realm had followed me back through that portal, then everything about my homecoming had just become considerably more dangerous overnight. That evening, Marcus called back, voice tight with something between excitement and genuine concern. The kind of tone that immediately told me his findings weren't simple at all. Hallworth's real name is Aldrich Voss, he said. Found old immigration records buried under 3 layers of legal name changes. The guy's been doing this for at least 15 years. Doing what exactly? I asked, gripping the phone tighter, already suspecting the answer wouldn't be anything close to comforting, given everything we'd uncovered already. Corporate parasitism, basically, Marcus said. He finds vulnerable companies, usually right after some kind of major leadership crisis, then slowly drains them from the inside. That matched everything my father's contact had found, except now we had an actual name, an actual pattern, something concrete enough to potentially build a real case around. There's something else, Marcus added, voice dropping slightly. Every company he's touched eventually reported strange incidents. Animals acting aggressive, unexplained disappearances. My stomach tightened uncomfortably at the detail, the pieces slowly arranging themselves into a picture I genuinely didn't want to be looking at directly right now. Define unexplained disappearances, I said carefully, already bracing myself for an answer that would likely confirm exactly what I'd started quietly suspecting since last night. Employees, mostly low-level ones, Marcus said, reported missing, usually written off as quitting suddenly without notice. Nobody ever seriously investigated the actual pattern. I think Marcus promised to update him soon, and sat alone in my room for a long time afterward, staring at the small metal box containing that strange, dark sample. Voss wasn't just stealing companies. Wherever he went, something else seemed to follow closely behind him, something that apparently fed quietly on people nobody bothered missing. I thought about the flattened grass near our fence, the cold metallic scent, the way Biscuit had reacted with genuine, instinctive fear towards something I couldn't fully identify yet. Whatever Voss had brought with him into this world, intentionally or not, it had apparently followed him straight to my family's doorstep without any hesitation at all. I needed more than suspicion now. I needed to understand exactly what kind of creature might be capable of crossing dimensions. Alongside a man who specialized in slow, patient destruction, the beast realm had taught me plenty about predators that hunted in silence, that tested boundaries before committing fully to an attack, that waited for the perfect moment patiently. If something like that had attached itself to Voss, then his presence in Theo's company wasn't just a financial threat anymore. It was something considerably more dangerous entirely. I spent the night researching everything I could remember about creatures from the realm that behaved similarly, creatures that fed on fear, on isolation, on slow accumulated despair. There had been one type, rare and rarely seen even by veteran survivors, that attached itself to ambitious, ruthless individuals, feeding off the chaos those people left behind them. We used to call them shadow leeches, though nobody I ever met had actually fought one directly and survived to describe the experience in any kind of useful detail afterward. If that's what had followed Voss through whatever crack he'd somehow used to cross dimensions, then this entire situation had just become exponentially more complicated overnight. I needed proof, real proof, something beyond strange scents and flattened grass. Something concrete enough to convince my family this threat was real. Before it grew considerably worse, the opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 nights later, Biscuit woke me suddenly, barking sharply from his spot beside my bed. Body rigid and focused toward the window completely. I rushed to look outside, heart pounding, and froze the second my eyes adjusted to the darkness beyond the glass. Because something was definitely crouched near the fence line. It wasn't quite visible, more like a distortion in the air itself. Shadows bending wrong around something that clearly didn't want to be seen clearly by human eyes. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to capture some kind of evidence, but the moment the camera focused, the shape seemed to ripple and vanish, leaving only empty darkness behind. Biscuit continued barking until I finally calmed him down. Both of us standing at the window for nearly an hour afterward, watching an empty yard that no longer felt entirely empty. The next morning, I told my father everything, including my theory about a creature potentially crossing dimensions alongside Voss. Watching his expression shift from doubt to genuine alarm. "You're saying something from where you were trapped followed you, or followed him back into our world," he said slowly, like saying it aloud made the idea somehow more real. "I'm saying I don't know exactly what's out there," I admitted honestly, "but I know enough about predators to recognize patient, deliberate hunting when I genuinely see it happening." My mother, listening from the doorway, wrapped her arms tightly around herself. The protective instinct she carried since the day I returned now sharpened into something close to fear. "What do we do?" she asked quietly, voice steadier than I expected given everything she had absorbed over the past several days. "Regarding our suddenly complicated, dangerous situation, we prepare," I said simply, "and we figure out exactly what Voss brought with him. Because right now, that's the only piece of this puzzle that genuinely terrifies me completely." Over the following days, I split my attention carefully between two fronts, helping Marcus build a case against Voss while quietly preparing the house against whatever lurked outside. I reinforced the fence with materials that smelled strongly of certain herbs. The wolves back in the realm had always avoided a small, desperate attempt at creating some kind of barrier. I taught my sister basic defensive movements during quiet afternoons, watching her absorb the lessons faster than I expected. Fierce determination replacing her earlier nervous uncertainty. Biscuit, meanwhile, refused to leave the yard unsupervised, patrolling the fence line with a kind of dedicated focus that made me genuinely grateful for stubborn, loyal old dogs everywhere. My father continued digging through Theo's paperwork, occasionally finding small, damning details that added weight to the growing case slowly forming against both Theo and Voss together. Then, exactly 1 week after my first encounter with the creature near the fence, Marcus called with news that finally tied every loose thread together into one terrifying conclusion. I found records of a warehouse Voss purchased privately, off the books, registered under yet another false name, he said, located just outside the city, completely abandoned officially. "Why would someone hide an abandoned warehouse?" I asked, though some quiet, instinctive part of me already suspected exactly what kind of answer was coming next from him. "Because it's not actually abandoned," Marcus said grimly. "Security footage from a nearby business shows unusual activity at night. Things moving that don't match normal human movement patterns." My grip tightened on the phone, the pieces finally clicking together completely, forming a picture considerably darker than anything I'd previously allowed myself to fully imagine. Voss wasn't just managing a creature that followed him accidentally. He was deliberately keeping it somewhere private, feeding it, controlling it, building something far worse than corporate fraud. "I need the location," I said immediately, voice steady despite the cold dread settling deep into my chest at the implications of everything we just uncovered together tonight. Marcus hesitated. "This is way beyond a simple favor now," he said carefully. "If half of what we're suspecting is true, you genuinely shouldn't be handling this completely alone." "I'm not planning to handle it completely alone," I said, glancing toward Biscuit, who lifted his head immediately, ears perked, like he understood exactly what was coming next for both of us. But I needed eyes on the warehouse before bringing anyone else into something this dangerous, especially family who'd already lost 10 years to my disappearance once before already. That night, lying awake with the warehouse address burning steadily in my mind, I focused inward one final time, reaching deliberately for whatever power still slept beneath my skin. The shimmer responded instantly now, stronger than ever before, spreading warmth through every limb until my entire body felt charged with something dangerously close to readiness. Whatever waited inside the warehouse, whatever Voss had been quietly feeding and controlling for who knows how many months, I finally understood it was time to stop simply observing. Tomorrow, I decided, watching Biscuit settle peacefully against my side, completely unaware of the decision quietly forming in the darkness beside him. Everything was finally going to change, because surviving 10 years in the beast realm hadn't just taught me how to run from predators. It had taught me, eventually, exactly how to become considerably more dangerous than them. And whatever Voss had been hiding in the warehouse was about to discover, far too late, that the man who walked back through the gate wasn't quite as harmless as everyone assumed. The warehouse sat at the edge of an industrial lot, surrounded by rusted fences and the kind of silence that feels deliberate, rather than simply empty by accident. I parked 2 blocks away, leaving the engine off, watching the building through the windshield while Biscuit pressed his nose against the glass, ears sharply forward. No lights, no cars. Nothing that suggested an active business operated here, which honestly made the whole place feel considerably more dangerous than if it had. I told Biscuit to stay, which earned me an offended huff. But 10 years of instinct told me whatever waited inside wasn't something a loyal old dog should face directly. He whined once, then settled reluctantly into the back seat, watching me through the window with the kind of betrayed expression only dogs can truly perfect completely. I crossed the lot low and quiet, since it stretched as far as they'd reach, picking up that same cold, metallic scent growing steadily stronger with every careful step forward. The side door hung slightly open, hinges rusted, like someone had stopped bothering with security a long time ago and simply relied on fear to keep visitors away instead. Inside, the air felt thick, heavy with that same iridescent stain I'd found near our fence, smeared across the concrete floor in patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate. Crates lined the far wall, broken open, contents scattered, though most of what remained looked less like cargo and more like remnants of something that had been fed here recently. I moved deeper, careful and silent, every survival instinct from the realm screaming at me to slow down, to listen, to trust the cold dread settling steadily in my chest. Then I heard it, a low, wet breathing sound coming from somewhere behind a stack of crates, irregular, patient, the unmistakable rhythm of something large and very much awake. I froze completely, watching shadows shift unnaturally near the back corner, the air itself seeming to bend slightly around something that clearly didn't want to be fully seen. A voice, dry and amused, spoke from somewhere above me, and I realized late that I'd walked straight into exactly the kind of trap a patient predator sets carefully. "Took you long enough to find this place," Voss said, stepping into view from a catwalk overhead, his calm smile somehow more unsettling than the creature breathing nearby. "You should have stayed gone," he continued. 10 years of silence built me an empire. A few more months would have made it permanent before anyone bothered asking questions. I kept my eyes on the shifting shadows instead of him, refusing to let the real threat slip from my attention while he monologued from his comfortable, elevated position. "What is the thing?" I asked, voice steady despite every nerve in my body screaming at me to retreat immediately back toward the door I'd entered through minutes earlier. "Something that followed me home," he said simply. "Turns out the place you disappeared into isn't quite as sealed as everyone assumed it was for the past 10 years. So you've been here before," I said slowly, understanding crashing into place with sickening clarity. "You found a way through, just like me, except you brought something back." Voss's smile widened. "I didn't bring it back," he corrected. "It followed me, the same way it apparently followed something else hiding inside your own bloodstream right now." The shadows finally moved fully into view, revealing something with too many joints, skin like wet shale, and eyes that held no pupils, only dark, patient hunger instead. It tilted its head slightly, studying me the way predators study prey that hasn't fully realized yet exactly how outmatched it actually is in this particular moment. Biscuit's distant, frantic barking suddenly echoed faintly from outside, the dog clearly sensing danger even through closed car windows to entire blocks away from here. Voss laughed quietly. "Even the dog knows you shouldn't have come alone," he said, "though I suppose loyalty rarely accounts for basic, practical survival instincts properly." The creature lunged the moment I shifted my weight, faster than anything that size should logically move, and I barely twisted aside as wet claws raked across my shoulder. Pain flared bright and immediate, but underneath it, something else stirred instantly. That familiar shimmer beneath my skin finally surging fully awake for the first time. My vision sharpened violently, colors bleeding into impossible clarity. The creature's next attack suddenly slow enough to read clearly half a second. Before it even started, I ducked low, driving my fist into his exposed side, and felt something crack beneath the impact with far more force than my 10 years of human muscle should produce alone. The creature shrieked, a sound that rattled the crates around us, stumbling backward while Voss's confident smile finally faltered for the first time since I'd arrived here. "That's not possible," he muttered, stepping back along the catwalk, voice losing its earlier composure as he watched me stand steady, despite the deep gash across my shoulder. Apparently your monster brought a souvenir home with it, I said, breathing hard, feeling power coil tightly through my limbs like something finally remembering its purpose. The creature recovered quickly, circling now instead of charging blindly, clearly recognizing that its initial assessment of easy prey had been seriously, dangerously wrong. I focused inward the way I had countless times in the realm, letting instinct override fear, letting 10 years of survival finally take full control of this exact moment. It lunged again, and this time I met it head-on, catching one clawed limb and twisting hard enough to hear something snap wetly. Beneath the creature's wet, shell-like skin, it howled, thrashing wildly, and in its panic clipped a stack of crates, sending splinterwood crashing down between us in a deafening, chaotic burst of noise and dust. Voss shouted something from above, voice sharp with genuine alarm now, scrambling toward a control panel mounted near the catwalk railing with frantic, hurried movements. Whatever he was reaching for, I doubted it was anything good for me, so I shoved the wounded creature hard toward the crates and sprinted directly for the metal stairs instead. The creature recovered just enough to swipe at my legs, and I felt claws catch fabric, tearing skin shallow but stinging as I forced myself up the stairs two at a time. Voss's hand slammed down on the panel just as I reached the top, and a low mechanical groan echoed through the warehouse, heavy shutters beginning to seal every exit shut. Clever trick, I said, grabbing his wrist before he could pull away, surprising him completely with how much faster I'd become since the conversation downstairs had started. He swung wildly with his free hand, but I caught that too, the strength in my grip clearly shocking him far more than the punch. He'd actually intended to land on me. You don't understand what you're dealing with, he hissed, struggling uselessly against a grip that 10 years ago would have been considerably weaker than his own. Honestly, I understand plenty, I said quietly. I understand you've been feeding something dangerous in secret, while threatening my family with lawyers and fake mental evaluations instead. Below us, the wounded creature shrieked again, slamming against the sealed shutters with growing desperation, clearly more interested in escape now than continuing this fight. Voss's eyes flicked toward it nervously. It's not fully under my control anymore, he admitted suddenly, voice cracking with something close to genuine fear for the first time. Then we have the exact same problem, I said, releasing him just enough to slam his shoulder against the railing, pinning him there while the creature continued thrashing below us. How do we stop it? I demanded, watching his composure crumble completely now that his carefully built control over the situation had clearly, finally slipped entirely away. There's a relic, he stammered, back in the crates. It feeds on pain, on chaos, but the relic can seal it again if you know how to use it correctly under pressure like this. Show me, I said, dragging him toward the stairs, the creature below growing more frantic by the second, as the sealed shutters trapped it tightly inside with both of us now. We descended carefully, Voss pointing toward a half-buried crate near the back wall, the same area the creature had originally emerged from minutes earlier during our fight. Inside, wrapped in cloth that smelled exactly like the cold metallic scent I'd been tracking for days, sat a small, dark stone humming faintly with quiet, contained energy. The creature noticed instantly, shrieking with something close to genuine panic, abandoning the shutters entirely and charging straight toward us with desperate, renewed speed. I grabbed the relic just as it lunged, instinct guiding my hand to press it firmly against the creature's exposed chest. The moment it crashed violently into both of us together, light erupted, cold and silver. The same shimmer I'd felt beneath my own skin now blazing outward in a wave that knocked Voss flat and sent the creature shrieking backward hard. The light wrapped around it slowly, tightening like invisible chains, until the creature folded inward on itself, collapsing into something small enough to fit inside my palm. Silence fell over the warehouse, heavy and complete, broken only by my own ragged breathing and Voss groaning weakly somewhere near the overturn. Crates close behind me. I stood there for a long moment, holding a small, dark stone that now hung with considerably more weight than it had minutes earlier, before finally turning toward Voss. This isn't over, he said weakly, struggling to sit upright, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow where he'd hit the concrete during the relic's sudden release of energy. You're right, I said calmly. It's not over, it's just beginning. Except this time you're not the one holding anything resembling actual leverage over my family anymore at all. I called Marcus from the warehouse parking lot, voice still rough from the fight, explaining enough details to get the authorities moving on Voss's tangled web of false identities. Biscuit nearly knocked me over the moment I reached the car, sniffing frantically at my torn shoulder before settling into anxious, protective circles around my legs entirely. "It's fine," I told him, scratching behind his ears despite the pain radiating through my arm. "We got him, buddy. We actually got him before things got considerably worse." By the time police arrived at the warehouse, Voss had already been detained. The creature secured inside its small stone prison locked carefully inside my jacket pocket. I didn't explain everything to the responding officers. Some details about interdimensional predators tend to complicate paperwork in ways nobody's actually prepared to process. Instead, I focused on the parts that mattered legally: the false identities, the illegal warehouse, the financial fraud connecting Voss directly to Theo's company records. When I finally drove home, the sun rising slowly over the city, my family was already awake, gathered anxiously in the kitchen after my father noticed I left sometime overnight. My mother's relief at seeing me alive quickly turned into alarm at the torn shoulder, immediately pulling out bandages while demanding an explanation I wasn't fully ready to give. I told them most of it, leaving out the smaller, stranger details about exactly what kind of creature I'd actually fought inside that abandoned, forgotten warehouse last night. "Voss is finished," I said simply. "Once this gets out, Theo's entire company collapses with him, unless he distances himself completely and immediately from everything connected." My father exhaled slowly, some visible weight finally lifting from his shoulders after days of quiet, exhausting fear about exactly how dangerous this situation had truly become. "And the thing you mentioned," he asked carefully, watching me with an expression that suggested he already suspected. There was considerably more to this story than I'd shared. "It's contained," I said, patting my jacket pocket gently. "For now. Whether it stays that way long-term is honestly a problem I haven't fully figured out solving yet." My sister stared at me with wide, fascinated eyes. "So you're basically some kind of superhero now," she said, half joking, half genuinely curious about the answer either way. "I'm just someone who survived 10 years somewhere terrible," I said honestly. "Whatever I brought back with me, good or bad, I'm still figuring out exactly what it actually means." Biscuit climbed onto the couch beside me, resting his head heavily against my bandaged shoulder, completely unconcerned with monsters, relics, or anything beyond this exact moment. That afternoon, news broke quickly across local channels about Voss's arrest, his tangled web of fraud finally unraveling publicly after years of careful, patient construction. Theo called repeatedly, voicemails increasingly desperate, his composed mask finally cracking completely now that the man pulling strings behind him had been exposed entirely. I let every single call go to voicemail, choosing instead to sit quietly in the backyard with Biscuit, watching the late afternoon sun stretch warm shadows across familiar grass. The relic sat heavy in my pocket, a quiet reminder that whatever I had brought back from the beast realm wasn't finished revealing itself, not by a considerable margin yet, because somewhere deep inside that small stone, something ancient and hungry waited patiently, exactly the same way it had waited inside the warehouse before I arrived. And somewhere out there, beyond Theo's collapsing empire and Voss's unraveling lies, I had a growing, uneasy feeling that this particular creature hadn't actually been alone. I thought about the flattened patches of grass near our fence, more than one, spaced oddly apart, like something had been pacing slowly around the entire property line. One creature explained a single set of tracks. It didn't explain why the set near the fence had occasionally shifted slightly, as if more than one presence had passed through there. I pulled the relic out that evening, studying the faint cracks spreading slowly across its dark surface, cracks that definitely hadn't been there when I first sealed it shut. Whatever was contained inside wasn't resting quietly. It was pushing, testing the edges of its prison the same patient way every predator in that realm tested every single boundary. Biscuit watched the stone from across the room, ears low, refusing to come anywhere near it. A reaction far more honest than any reassurance I could have given myself tonight. Tomorrow, I decided, sliding the relic back into its cloth wrapping carefully. I'd need to figure out exactly how permanent this containment actually was before trusting it fully. Because if something else really had crossed over with Voss, something patient enough to wait outside our fence for nights without striking, then this fight was far from finished. The next few nights passed quietly, almost suspiciously so. The kind of silence that makes a person more nervous than actual noise ever could. After everything we'd survived, I kept the relic locked in that same metal box, checking the cracks every morning, watching them spread slowly wider despite every careful precaution I tried adding around it. Biscuit refused to sleep anywhere except pressed directly against the box, almost guarding it. Like some instinct deep inside him understood exactly what was straining to escape. My father, meanwhile, used Voss's exposed fraud to finally corner Theo legally, presenting evidence that made continued denial completely impossible for him to maintain anymore. Theo showed up unannounced one evening, looking nothing like the polished man who'd walked into our kitchen weeks earlier, suit wrinkled, composure entirely, visibly gone now. I didn't know, he said immediately, before anyone could even speak, about Voss, about whatever he was actually doing in the warehouse. I genuinely had no idea any of it. Ignorance doesn't erase what you took, my father said calmly, voice carrying none of the anger I expected, just tired, steady disappointment that somehow felt heavier than rage. Theo's eyes flicked toward me, something unreadable passing across his face before he finally spoke again, voice quieter than I had ever heard him use in his entire adult life. I'll sign everything back, he said. The company, the properties, all of it. I just need you to understand I never wanted this to go anywhere near as far as it actually did. I studied him carefully, searching for the same calculating glint from our first encounter, finding instead something closer to genuine exhaustion and quiet, belated regret. Why now? I asked. You could have kept fighting this legally for months, dragged everything through court, made this considerably harder for everyone involved if you'd wanted to. Because Voss was never actually working for me, he admitted. I was working for him, and I only realized exactly how deep that arrangement went after his arrest exposed everything. That admission landed heavier than expected, reframing weeks of careful, calculated threats into something closer to a desperate man drowning under pressure he never fully controlled. Biscuit, surprisingly, walked over and sat beside Theo's feet, not affectionately, but watchfully. Like even he understood this particular threat had finally lost its actual teeth. I'll take the company back, I said finally, but you're going to help us untangle every single contract Voss touched, every name, every account, completely and honestly this time. Theo nodded slowly, some visible weight lifting from his shoulders the moment cooperation became the clear, obvious path forward instead of continued, exhausting confrontation. After he left, my mother exhaled slowly, sinking into a kitchen chair like she'd been holding tension in her body for days that had finally, mercifully been allowed to release. It's not over yet, I reminded everyone gently, glancing toward the metal box upstairs. But it's considerably closer to over than it was this exact same time last week honestly. That night, the cracks in the relic finally split fully open, and I woke to Biscuit's frantic, desperate barking, the metal box rattling violently against my bedroom floor. I grabbed it instantly, feeling heat radiate through the metal, watching silver light leak through widening fractures while something inside pulsed with growing, hungry intent. I ran for the backyard instead of waking my family, some instinct insisting this needed open space, distance from the people I'd already put through more than enough danger. The moment I set the box down on the grass, it shattered completely, and the creature reformed instantly, larger now, having apparently fed on something during its captivity. It lunged immediately, and this time I didn't hesitate. 10 years of survival finally converging completely, with whatever power the realm had quietly left inside me. My shoulder still ached from our last fight, but the shimmer beneath my skin surged stronger than ever, sharpening every sense until the entire backyard felt vividly alive. I caught its first strike directly, twisting hard enough to throw it off balance, following immediately with a strike that cracked audibly against its wet, shale-like hide. Biscuit charged from the porch despite my earlier warning, barking furiously, circling the creature's legs, distracting it just enough for me to land another solid hit cleanly. Get back, I shouted, though some stubborn part of me was honestly grateful for the help, even from an aging dog who clearly had zero intention of staying safely indoors tonight. The creature shrieked, swiping wildly, catching Biscuit's side hard enough to send him rolling across the grass with a sharp, pain yelp that froze my entire chest instantly. Something inside me snapped loose completely the moment that sound reached my ears, the shimmer beneath my skin exploding outward in a wave I hadn't fully intended to release. Silver light flooded the backyard, and the creature staggered backward, shrieking as the same energy that had originally sealed it now tore directly through its unstable form. I didn't hold back. I drove forward, channeling everything the realm had taught me, every desperate fight, every narrow survival, directly into a single, decisive final strike. The creature collapsed inward on itself, dissolving into thin, silver mist that scattered across the grass before fading completely into the cool night air. Around us both, silence fell heavy over the backyard, broken only by my own ragged breathing and Biscuit's whimpering as he limped slowly back toward me, tail wagging despite obvious pain. I dropped to my knees immediately, checking him carefully, relief flooding through me when I found nothing worse than bruised ribs and a few shallow, already healing scratches. "You stubborn, brave idiot," I whispered against his fur, voice cracking slightly, holding him close while the adrenaline slowly drained out of my exhausted, trembling body. Lights flicked on inside the house, my family rushing outside moments later, faces pale with fear at finding torn grass, scorched earth, and their returned son holding a bleeding dog. "I'm fine," I said quickly, before anyone could panic further. "We're both fine. Whatever the thing was, it's gone now. Completely and permanently gone this time around." My mother knelt immediately beside Biscuit, already checking him over with the same careful, practiced hands she'd used on my own scars weeks earlier after my own return home. My father simply stood there for a long moment, staring at the scorched patch of grass, processing exactly how much danger his entire family had quietly been living alongside. "That's it then," he finally said, voice rough. "Whatever followed you home, whatever Voss brought with him, it's actually finished now. Completely and properly finished tonight." "I think so," I said honestly, though some quiet, cautious part of me understood that 10 years in a realm like that rarely left things as neatly resolved as everyone hoped for. Still, watching my family gather closer around an exhausted dog and a scorched, empty backyard, I let myself believe, just for tonight, that the worst part was finally over now. The following weeks passed with a strange, welcome normalcy I genuinely hadn't expected to feel again after everything that happened. Since walking back through the gate, Theo, true to his word, helped untangle every fraudulent contract Voss had buried inside the company, restoring ownership properly while quietly stepping back from leadership entirely. He wasn't forgiven completely, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but the cold calculation from our first encounter never returned, replaced by something closer to genuine humility. Voss's trial moved slowly through the legal system, his tangled web of false identities providing prosecutors with considerably more material than anyone initially expected to find. I testified carefully, leaving out anything involving interdimensional creatures, focusing entirely on financial fraud, which honestly provided more than enough evidence regardless. Marcus became a regular fixture at family dinners, the two of us slowly rebuilding 10 years of lost friendship over considerably less dangerous topics than warehouse monsters. My sister, predictably, never stopped asking questions about my heightened senses, eventually convincing me to let her witness exactly how far my hearing actually reached now. She stood across the yard whispering numbers while I called them out correctly from the porch, equal parts delighted and slightly unnerved by her brother's strange new abilities. My mother stopped hovering quite so anxiously, though she still checked my scars occasionally, less out of worry now and more out of the simple comfort of confirming I was real. My father and I spent long evenings going through company records together, rebuilding something steadier than what Theo had left behind, this time built on actual trust again. Biscuit recovered fully within days, apparently far tougher than his graying fur suggested, returning to his favorite hobby of guarding me with stubborn, unwavering loyalty. One quiet evening, sitting on the back porch with him curled against my side, I finally let myself focus inward without any urgency, just curiosity about what remained changed. The shimmer was still there, steady now instead of unpredictable, settled into something that felt less like a foreign intrusion and more like a permanent part of who I'd become. 10 years in the beast realm had taken my voice, my face, nearly my entire sense of self, but it had also given something back, quietly woven into whatever I was becoming now. I thought about the wolves I'd run with, the silence I'd survived, the portal that eventually spat me back out into a life that had moved on, without ever fully letting me go. And I thought about the one creature in this entire world who never once doubted who I actually was, even covered in dirt, even unable to speak a single recognizable word. Biscuit shifted against my side, sighing contentedly, completely unaware of monsters, relics, or anything beyond the simple, comfortable warmth of this exact quiet moment together. Family, I learned slowly over these past few strange weeks, wasn't always about blood or paperwork or who recognized you first through suspicion and careful measure distance. Sometimes it was simpler than that. Sometimes it was an old dog breaking his own chain the moment he caught a familiar scent, refusing every single reasonable instinct to doubt. 10 years away, and the only one who truly never stopped waiting for me turned out to have 4 legs, terrible breath, and absolutely zero interest in legal documents whatsoever. I scratched behind his ears one more time, watching the sun finally dip below the horizon, painting the backyard in warm, gentle colors that felt nothing like the cold metallic dread of weeks earlier. Whatever else the beast realm had left inside me, whatever strange shimmer still lived quietly beneath my skin, I finally felt something close to steady ground beneath my feet again. And honestly, after surviving 10 years among monsters, coming home to find loyalty waiting exactly where I left it felt like the strangest, most welcome ending I could have asked for. If you actually made it through this entire story with me, drop a comment telling me whether Biscuit deserves his own spin-off. Because honestly, he's earned it more than I have. A month after the warehouse, the courts finally finalized Voss's sentencing. Years of fraud catching up to him all at once after a lifetime of carefully constructed escapes. Reporters tried reaching out to our family a few times, curious about the mysterious man who returned after a decade. But my father handled most of it with careful, practiced patience. We kept the strangest details private, obviously. Nobody needed headlines about interdimensional creatures, and honestly, nobody would have believed it without serious proof anyway. Theo eventually moved to a smaller office downtown, starting something modest of his own, occasionally calling to check in. The bitterness between us slowly softening into something workable. It wasn't the relationship we'd had as kids, not yet, but it was considerably better than the cold calculation in my kitchen that first morning. He'd walked back into my life uninvited. My sister started bringing friends over specifically to meet Biscuit, who had apparently become something of a local legend after word spread about his dramatic, chain-breaking reunion. He handled the attention with the same dignified indifference he handled everything else, accepting treats graciously while pretending the praise meant nothing to him whatsoever. My mother began sleeping easier, the constant tension that had lived in her shoulders since my return finally settling into something closer to normal, comfortable family rhythm. I started helping rebuild the company properly, learning the parts of the business I'd never actually cared about as a careless 18-year-old. Before everything happened to me, it turned out surviving 10 years of relentless danger gave a person considerably more patience for spreadsheets and contracts than anyone, including myself, ever expected honestly. Marcus joined the company eventually too, his security background proving useful for making sure nothing remotely resembling Voss ever slipped through our doors again unnoticed. Some nights, I still woke from dreams about the realm, the wolves, the silence. But they came less often now, replaced gradually by quieter, steadier nights spent simply at home. I never fully explained the shimmer to anyone outside my immediate family, not even Marcus, though I suspected he occasionally noticed things he diplomatically chose not to mention. Biscuit, of course, knew everything already, the way dogs always do, watching silently whenever I tested my senses, never once flinching at whatever strange thing I'd actually become. There were moments, quiet ones, where I caught myself wondering whether the realm had taken more than it gave, whether 10 years was a price worth whatever power followed me home. Then I'd look at my family gathered around the dinner table, laughing at something small and ordinary, and decide the question itself didn't actually matter anymore at all, because whatever I'd lost out there, whatever strange thing now lived quietly beneath my skin, none of it changed the simple fact that I'd actually made it back to them eventually, and somewhere between the scars, the broken voice slowly healing into something steadier, and an old dog refusing to ever leave my side again, I finally started feeling human once more.